In this lesson, we'll discuss another technique that Spring Boot uses to facilitate the configuration of Spring projects. This technique is known as auto configuration. When we enable auto configuration using the Enable Auto Configuration annotation, we are signaling to Spring Boot that we would like the framework to make intelligent guesses about the types of configurations and the types of beans that we will need within our project. When using auto configuration, it's important that we place the Enable Auto Configuration annotation on our main class or the class that runs our application. So here you see the annotation applied to the application type, and it's also important that class resides within a properly packaged structure. So here you see the com.o'reilly.boot package, and then within that package is our application. We want to avoid placing our main class within the default package because it's going to have some later consequences for some of the scanning that will occur. For example, the Enable Auto Configuration annotation serves as a marker for the base package, which we will then use to perform scanning for our different entities in something like JPA. Essentially, auto configuration enables specific features within our application without us explicitly defining the beans necessary for that feature and their configuration. So let's walk through an example to see a little bit more what we're talking about. First, if we look at our pom.xml file, you'll notice that we have included the Spring Boot Starter Web POM. And if we look at the dependencies within that POM, you'll notice it's pulling in a lot of different artifacts. There we actually see an embedded Tomcat being placed within our class path. And if we look at our Maven dependencies, we do in fact see embedded Tomcat. And that's because we are working with a web application. Now, normally we would need to specify some information or configuration to Tomcat. But what happens is the auto configuration feature within Spring Boot detects this jar on our class path and recognizes that it needs to provide us with some default configurations. And this allows us to get up and running very quickly and very smoothly. So let's go one level deeper and talk about how this is accomplished. One of the ways we can really see some of the internals of this auto configuration feature is by adjusting our run configuration. So within our run configuration, all we need to do is click the Enable Debug Output checkbox and then hit Apply, and then we can close our configuration. Next, we'll go to the Run menu item and we can run as a Spring Boot application. And if we now inspect our console, you'll see that we get some debugging output which talks about the different checks that the auto configuration is making to determine what types of configurations are appropriate. So towards the top of our console output, you're going to see that we have these positive matches. And what's going on is Spring Boot is using different conditional annotations. And basically, these conditional annotations check to see if a particular condition is present. And if it is, it will then apply the configuration. And we'll take a closer look at that. But here you see that it's running the embedded servlet container auto configuration check, and it's checking that the Tomcat class is on our class path, and then it also makes sure that we don't have any other servlet containers set up so it doesn't overwrite some configuration that we would actually like. And if you look within the dependencies pulled down with Maven, you'll see the Spring Boot auto configure jar. And within this jar, you're going to find a bunch of these auto configuration checks that Spring Boot performs in order to determine how to configure our application. So here we do see the embedded servlet container auto configuration class. And if we look at the source for that class, what you're going to notice is that our checks are there. So there we see the configuration annotation. We're using Java configuration. And then we use these conditional annotations to determine whether or not we should build out an embedded Tomcat container for use by our application. So that's a little bit about how Spring Boot actually works to perform our auto configuration. So one of the key principles with auto configuration in Spring Boot is that the framework will attempt to provide you with the best configuration possible. But if you specify your own specific configuration, the auto configuration will then back off. So for example, when we run our web application here, because we have auto configuration enabled and we have the Tomcat server on our class path, the auto configuration within Spring Boot knows that we need to run a web application, stand up a Tomcat server, and then it applies some defaults, like we're going to be on port 8080, that we're going to use the root as our context path, so it's just going to be localhost 8080. And we can see that if we just navigate to our application. But what if you need to change that? Well, that's the great thing about the auto configuration is that it will back away in those cases. There are several ways to specify your specific configurations. Let's just take a quick look at one of them. If we go into the run configurations, we can specify arguments for our application. And there are these defined configuration properties that we can specify. So for the server port, it's just server.port, and we can set that to 9000. And then we can also change our context path with server.context-path, and then we just set it to whatever we would like. And then we can go ahead and apply those configuration changes, and they will be provided as a program argument, and then we can go ahead and close. Now, one important thing when you're working with Spring Boot in STS is you'll want to use this relaunch Spring Boot application button to continually run your application, or else the previous Java process will not shut down. So let's go ahead and we'll run our new application configuration. And just taking a look at it here, you can see there we did start up on port 9000. And if we go to our browser and we switch our port over to 9000, and then we use the context path of test, we once again hit our application, just with a different configuration that the auto configuration within Spring Boot did not overwrite. So here you see one of the ways that Spring Boot really facilitates our configuration of our Spring projects, and that's using auto configuration. And it works hand in hand with the starter POMs. I really wouldn't recommend using them independently, although you can, but they really seem to work very well together. So with those two facilities provided by Spring Boot, you can get fully configured projects. And then if you'd like to modify those projects, you can always go to your run configurations, and within your Spring Boot app, you can provide specific arguments via the Arguments tab. And using the auto configuration from Spring Boot, we can really simplify our configurations, and it takes a lot of that work away from the developer.